Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever been so deep into something that you couldn't tell where it ended and where you began? That's what it felt like the moment I cracked into the system. The building had been abandoned for years, but its network was still alive, a ghost in the machine. A perfect target. My client wanted information, something classified, locked away. It was too tempting to ignore. I should have backed out when I saw the code. But I didn't. Ambition, pride, and the promise of a fat paycheck clouded my judgment. I was a hacker, after all. This was what I did. Breaking through layers of security, diving into encrypted files that most people wouldn't dare to touch, that was the thrill. I could almost taste it as I bypassed the final firewall and cracked open the first encrypted file. That's when I found it. A folder hidden deep in the system with no label, no name. Just a string of characters that made my blood run cold. The folder didn't belong. There was something wrong about it. Like it had been placed there on purpose, waiting for someone to open it. And I opened it. The files inside were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were filled with code, sophisticated, cryptic, like a language I didn't understand. But there were also images. Strange, blurry photos that sent a shiver down my spine. Dark hallways, flickering lights, people with their faces obscured. There were dozens of them, each more disturbing than the last. I scrolled, unable to stop myself, my fingers numb against the keyboard. Then I found a document. It was simple at first glance, a plain text file. But when I opened it, the words seemed to move, shifting on the screen like something alive. The code is awake. It knows you're here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. Was this some kind of sick joke? My mind raced, but there was no time to process. I had already gone too far. I clicked to close the file, but the screen froze. The cursor flickered, and the text blurred as if the file was rewriting itself before my eyes. You shouldn't have come. The words appeared again, but this time they weren't on the screen. They were in my head. Suddenly, the power in the building flickered. The lights above me buzzed, casting strange shadows on the walls. A low hum filled the air, like an engine starting up, distant but growing louder. I turned, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. My hands were shaking. I couldn't understand what was happening. Was I losing my mind? I looked back at the screen. The file was still open, but now there was something else, a new line of code, a string of characters I didn't recognize. I tried to disconnect, to shut everything down, but the computer wouldn't respond. It was as if the system was alive, refusing to let me go. My heartbeat quickened, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. I had to get out of there, but my body wouldn't move. It knew I was there. It was waiting. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath me. The building wasn't just old, it was decaying, alive with something I couldn't explain. And it was calling me into the depths of its code. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen went black, and I felt it, a presence, creeping in from all sides. A shadow, subtle but undeniable, pressing against my mind. The room felt colder, the air heavier. I glanced back at the screen, the text blinking at me, as if mocking me. It's too late to leave. And then I heard the sound. A soft tapping, rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the room. I wasn't alone. The tapping continued, low and methodical, like a heartbeat coming from the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes darting around the dimly lit space. There was no one else here, I was sure of it. The office was small, cluttered with old equipment, and I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The tapping grew louder, more pronounced. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the computer. I turned toward it, my gaze locked on the screen that still flickered with that strange text. The lines of code seemed to have morphed, shifting in real time, forming new words. I leaned in closer, as if doing so might help me make sense of it, but I only felt the creeping sensation that something was watching me. You shouldn't have opened it, the file now read. The tapping stopped. A chill ran through my spine. I pulled my chair away from the desk, but my body felt frozen. My mind screamed at me to get out, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, longer this time. The hum in the air grew deafening, almost as if the building itself was vibrating. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, warping into unnatural shapes that danced just beyond the corner of my vision. I felt a sharp pressure in my chest, like something was pushing against me. I turned my head toward the door. It was shut, locked. There was no way out. And yet, I could feel it, a presence, thick and suffocating, closing in around me. I could feel it, hear it, in the silence between the flickers of light. Without thinking, I grabbed my things, my laptop, my phone, anything I could reach, and bolted for the door. My hand gripped the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck. I turned it again, frantic, but there was no way out. Then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint whisper, like a crackling in the static. But it was there, coming from behind me, from the direction of the screen. You can't leave. I spun around, my heart racing. The room was empty. Nothing moved. But I could feel it, something was watching me. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed from the far corner of the room. I couldn't see anyone, but the steps were real. The walls were closing in, and I could feel the pressure mounting on me. I moved back to the desk, trying to calm myself. I opened the laptop again, but the screen was different now. The file was gone, replaced by something new. A series of numbers, strings of binary, scrolling across the screen faster than I could comprehend. Then, a face appeared. Not just any face. It was distorted, like something caught between two realities. It flickered, half human, half something else, its features twisted, shifting, as though it were trying to maintain its form. You found it, the face seemed to whisper, its voice a low, guttural murmur. I stumbled backward, hitting the chair. My mind raced, desperately trying to process what was happening. The face wasn't just on the screen anymore. It was in the room with me, somehow bleeding out of the pixels, invading my space. The air grew colder, the lights flickering more violently now. The tapping noise returned, more intense than before, like something, or someone, was walking around me in circles. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps. Real, solid footsteps. And then, a knock on the door. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound was real. I slowly approached the door, my breath coming in short gasps. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. I backed away, my body screaming for escape, but the door wasn't the way out anymore. Something was waiting for me on the other side, something that knew I was trapped. And it wasn't going to let me leave. "It's already too late," the face on the screen whispered, its smile stretching unnaturally wide. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed toward the window, looking out into the night. The city was quiet, empty, and cold. But something else was there, standing beneath the street lamp across the alley, a figure. It wasn't human. Its form was too still, too dark, like a shadow that stretched too long. And then I realized it. The shadow, it was mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The code had found me. I stood frozen, my heart racing. The shadow in the alley mirrored my every movement, but it wasn't mine. I could feel its presence, not just in the reflection outside, but inside my own mind. My thoughts were disjointed, swirling like static. It was as though the very air around me was thickening, closing in like a vice. The knocking at the door continued, more insistent now, but I didn't dare answer. I didn't want to open it. Not when I could feel the thing on the other side, waiting, watching. The face on the screen had disappeared, but its voice, that low whisper, lingered in my ears. It was like a ringing in my skull. "You've unlocked it. You can never leave." I turned away from the window, my legs trembling. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. The walls seemed to shift, the corners bending inwards. My head spun, the sound of my pulse thumping in my ears, louder than the footsteps, louder than the knocking. I tried to focus. My phone. I grabbed it from the desk, frantically searching for a signal. But the screen was blank. No bars. Nothing. I tried dialing, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen flashed, and for a split second, I saw the words. "Too late." Then, the door rattled. The sound was louder now, as if something, or someone, was pounding on it from the other side with full force. I jerked backward, the phone slipping from my hand and crashing to the floor. I glanced around the room, desperate for an escape. The window? No. The alley was still there, but now it seemed impossibly far away, the shadows too deep. My mind raced, but there was no solution. The door. I had to get out. But the door wouldn't open. I rushed to the desk, trying to focus on the computer, trying to find something that would make sense of what was happening. But the screen was still showing that distorted face, its eyes wide with an unnatural gleam. "Why did you open it?" the face asked, its voice cold, like 100 whispers overlapping. I slammed the laptop shut, but the voice didn't stop. It echoed in my head, filling every corner of my mind. "You can't undo it. You can't escape." The pressure in the room grew unbearable. I could feel something closing in on me, something ancient and oppressive. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The tapping, the footsteps, the whispers, they were everywhere now, surrounding me. There was nowhere to hide. No way out. And then, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I heard the sound of breathing. It was close, too close. I held my breath, waiting. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, anything. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, unable to even take a step. The coldness of the air was now more than just temperature, it was a presence. A weight. It settled on my chest, pushing the air out of my lungs. A soft whisper broke the silence, too quiet to make sense of, but unmistakably there. It's here. The sound of movement came from the shadows, just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. The fear was overwhelming, like every fiber of my being was screaming in terror. I could feel its presence, that dark thing from the other side of the door. The screen on the laptop flickered back to life, glowing in the darkness. The face was back, but now it was grinning. The smile was too wide, its teeth too sharp. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My mind couldn't form a plan. I was stuck. I reached for the desk, my hand trembling, and fumbled for the power cord. I needed the lights. I needed to see. My fingers grazed the cold metal of the cable, and with a desperate yank, I disconnected the laptop. The screen went black. But the face didn't go away. It was in my mind now, behind my eyes, in my thoughts. Its voice, louder now, filled the entire room. You're mine now. And then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails on glass. Slow. Steady. It was coming from the walls. No, not the walls. From inside my head. The room around me was spinning, reality warping. My thoughts scattered. I couldn't tell if the shadows were closing in on me or if I was sinking into them. I finally found the strength to move, to stumble toward the door again. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. My hand grasped the handle, no longer cold, but burning with an unnatural heat. I turned it. It opened. On the other side, the hallway stretched into infinite darkness. The walls, the floors, everything around me seemed to breathe, like the building itself was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of something far older than me. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the tapping again. But this time, it was coming from behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped into the hallway, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The air felt thicker here, heavier, like it was pushing against me. I couldn't tell whether it was the anxiety seizing me or something else, something more tangible. The door clicked shut behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. I had no choice but to move forward. There was nowhere else to go. The sound of footsteps followed me, slow and deliberate. Each step was calculated, almost mocking. It was as if someone, was walking just behind me, waiting. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps kept matching mine, almost in sync, only to slow again when I slowed. They were constant, rhythmic, filling the hallway with a strange, suffocating pressure. A shadow crossed my path ahead, too quick for me to react. My pulse spiked. My breath came in shallow gasps. I froze, staring into the void ahead. Had I imagined it? I didn't think so. Suddenly, the whispers began again. A low hum at first, then rising in intensity until they filled every corner of the hallway. My head felt heavy, as though the air was pressing into my skull. The words weren't clear, but they were there, insistent, demanding. Unlock it, find the code, you must. I stumbled back, eyes darting around the corridor, searching for the source of the voices. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. But the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in around me with each step. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs trembling beneath me. Sweat clung to my skin, my thoughts muddled and scattered. The deeper I ventured, the more the building seemed to distort. The floor beneath me felt uneven, like it was shifting, warping. The shadows along the walls seemed to move of their own accord. I rounded a corner, and there, at the end of the hallway, I saw it. A door, a faint flicker of light coming from underneath it. It looked like the same room from before, the one I had been hacking into. But something about it was different now. The closer I got, the more I could feel its pull, like it was calling to me. I approached it cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I was compelled, my feet dragging me toward that door as if I were no longer in control. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, overlapping with each other. A cacophony of voices that felt as if they were coming from every direction. You unlocked it. You're here now. You have to stay. My hand trembled as it reached for the handle, and for a moment, I hesitated. I could feel the heat radiating from the door, as though it were alive. But I had no choice. I opened it. The room beyond was empty. Or at least, it seemed that way at first. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something strange: the walls. They were covered in symbols, scratched into the paint like something had clawed them into place. The air was thick with static, like the entire room was alive, waiting. A computer sat in the center of the room, its screen flickering erratically. My mind raced. This was it. This was where it all started. I approached the computer, my hand shaking as I sat down in front of it. The screen came to life with a jolt, lines of code scrolling down faster than I could process. I tried to focus, but my thoughts were scattered, confused. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, moving just at the edge of my vision. I couldn't tell if they were real, or if it was just my mind starting to crack under the pressure. The screen froze. I reached forward to touch the mouse, but before my fingers could make contact, the lights in the room flickered violently. The computer screen flashed, then went black. My heart skipped a beat. The room fell silent. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound. Someone, was moving closer. The shadows shifted, and I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall. Taller than any person should be. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel it watching me, its presence suffocating. A low, guttural growl echoed from the figure, like something ancient and malevolent waking up after a long slumber. I stood frozen, unable to move. The shadows around me deepened, closing in on me until I could barely breathe. The whispering voices returned, louder than before. You can't leave. You opened it. Now you're part of it. I reached for the door, but my hand passed through the air as though the door had vanished. There was no way out. I was trapped. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. I could feel its coldness, its malice seeping into my skin. The whispers in my mind grew louder, almost deafening. And then, in the silence, I heard a single, chilling word. Code. And just like that, the world around me shattered. I stumbled back, disoriented, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room swirled around me, everything spinning like the world had just been turned upside down. The coldness from the figure was suffocating, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Its shadow stretched unnaturally, filling every inch of the room with its presence. The whispers, now a cacophony of unintelligible voices, seemed to come from every direction at once, echoing in my skull. Code. The word echoed in my mind, reverberating like a bell tolling in a distant, unreachable place. I had no idea what it meant. I couldn't understand why it was haunting me, but it was clear I had no choice. My eyes flicked to the computer screen, now a flickering mess of broken code and distorted images. There was something there. A message buried deep within the chaos. My mind struggled to focus through the fog of terror, but something was pulling me toward it, something that felt like both a warning and an invitation. Unlock it, or stay. The whisper slithered through my thoughts, so close I could almost feel its breath. The screen continued to flicker, lines of code bleeding into each other, a code I didn't understand, but knew I had to decipher. I didn't have a choice. There was no turning back now. I reached forward, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I tried to interact with the corrupted system. The keyboard felt foreign beneath my fingers, each key sticking like it was fighting back, but I pressed on. With every stroke, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows more oppressive. And then, a line of text appeared on the screen. Final code 6E5A9F. I stared at it, barely able to comprehend what it meant. The figure in the doorway didn't move. It just watched, its presence looming over me like a dark cloud. I had no idea what would happen if I entered the code. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I was frozen, trapped in place by the relentless pull of the screen, by the force of the entity that now seemed to be linked to me. The whisper returned, louder this time, almost deafening in its urgency. Enter it now! I felt a sickening rush of panic. My hand hovered over the keyboard, fingers trembling. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its tall, thin form barely moving, yet it was everywhere. The air felt thick with pressure, as if time itself had stopped. Without thinking, my fingers hit the keys. 6E5 and 9F. The moment the last character was pressed, the room seemed to lurch. The shadows twisted violently, the walls bending, creaking under some unseen weight. The air was alive, crackling with static, as if the entire building were waking up. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. I held my breath, unable to move, unable to make sense of what was happening. The whispers grew into a roaring storm, crashing against my eardrums. My body trembled, my nerves on fire as the world around me seemed to collapse inward. The temperature dropped even further, until it felt like the very blood in my veins had turned to ice. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the screen. I shielded my eyes, but the light was too much, too intense. I could hear the sound of metal scraping, the echoes of something shifting behind me. And then, without warning, the screen went black again. The silence that followed was unbearable. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in jagged, panic bursts. I was still in the same room, at least, I thought I was, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on me, and I could feel something behind me, just out of sight, its presence like a weight on my shoulders. And then, the cold voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't from the figure in the doorway. It was inside my mind. You're part of it now. There's no escape. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The figure was gone, but its presence still lingered, hanging heavy in the air. The shadows no longer behaved as they should. They moved, shifting on their own, as if they were alive, sentient. I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that I was no longer in control of anything. The building, the room, the code, it had all consumed me. The screen flickered once more, and then a final message appeared. Your code is the key, but the door is closed forever. I staggered backward, a sob breaking free from my chest. The building was no longer just a place, it had become a prison. I was trapped in a world I couldn't escape. The whispers didn't stop. They continued to gnaw at my mind, growing louder with every passing second. There was no turning back. The code had sealed my fate. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, the room was silent. I first noticed it on Tuesday. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a fleeting sensation, a feeling that something was off. You know that sensation, don't you? The one where you're sure someone's staring at you, but when you glance over your shoulder, you see nothing. For days, I brushed it off, convinced it was just my imagination. After all, who would be watching me? I was no one important. But then it happened again and again. Every time I turned a corner, every time I stepped into a cafe or boarded the subway, the feeling would return. At first, it was just an odd glance here and there, a slight tilt of the head, as if someone were watching me, but I couldn't pinpoint who. Then, I began to notice the patterns. The same faces, appearing at the same times, in the same places. I would spot one in the subway, then see another across the street. It wasn't just one person anymore, it was a group. And that's when the fear began to set in. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Everyone has the occasional moment of unease, right? So, I ignored it. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, what could a group of strangers possibly want with me? But the staring didn't stop. It got worse. One evening, after work, I stopped at a cafe on my way home. It wasn't anything special, just a small place where I often grabbed a cup of coffee before heading to my apartment. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the familiar scent of espresso and baked goods filled the air. It was quiet, like always, save for the occasional murmur of conversation from a few customers sitting near the windows. I took my usual seat by the far wall, away from the windows, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The barista, a young woman with short, dark hair, gave me a polite nod. She didn't seem to notice anything strange. But I did. The moment I sat down, I saw it, just across from me, a man with a deep scar running down his cheek. He was reading a newspaper, his face partially hidden behind the pages. But his eyes, they weren't on the paper. They were on me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. There it was again, the gaze. I quickly looked away, pretending I hadn't noticed. But I could still feel it. I could still sense his eyes on me. The next few minutes felt like hours. I tried to focus on the cup in front of me, but the feeling of being watched was too overwhelming. My hands began to shake. I glanced up again, and there he was, still watching me from over the top of his newspaper. His eyes were cold, calculating. It was as though he knew everything about me. Then, something strange happened. He folded the paper, stood up, and walked out of the cafe without taking his eyes off me. I sat there, staring after him. My mind raced. What was going on? Was he following me? Was he a part of something? The thought made my stomach turn. I paid for my coffee and left the cafe, my steps quick and purposeful. I had to get home, away from whatever this was. But as I stepped outside, the sense of being watched was even stronger. I turned to look, and there, just across the street, was the man. He wasn't alone anymore. There were two others with him, standing silently under the street lamp. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but the way they stood, so still, so deliberate, it sent a chill through me. I turned away and started walking faster, my pulse racing. My mind was clouded with fear. It was no longer just one person, it was a group. And I had no idea what they wanted or how long they had been watching me. As I made my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, following me from the shadows. But when I looked back, they were gone. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Every corner I turned, every new place I visited, I felt their presence lingering just beyond my line of sight. It was as if they were always there, watching, waiting. At work, I could feel my coworkers' eyes lingering a bit too long whenever I passed by. I caught glimpses of their faces in the elevator, their eyes darting away quickly as if they were just as startled by the sight of me as I was by theirs. But I wasn't imagining it. I could feel the weight of their gaze. One morning, I took the subway to work, hoping that being in a crowded place would make me feel safe, like I was just another face in the crowd. But when I boarded the train, I froze. There, across the car, sitting as still as statues, were the same three people I had seen before. The man with the scar, the tall woman with dark sunglasses, and a third person, a younger man, whose face was mostly hidden by a hood. They were sitting quietly, their eyes fixed on me. The moment our gazes met, my stomach dropped. I tried to look away, but it was too late. They knew I had seen them. I could feel their eyes on me, even when I tried to distract myself with my phone. My heart began to race. I knew I couldn't stay on this train. I waited for the next stop, the only place I could make a quick exit. As soon as the doors opened, I stepped out, my feet moving faster than my thoughts. I was breathing hard, heart pounding in my chest. I knew they had followed me. I didn't even have to turn around to see them. I could feel it, their presence was suffocating. They were behind me, right there in the crowd. I ducked into the nearest alley, trying to blend in with the shadows. My hands shook as I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, praying they wouldn't notice me slipping away. For a moment, it was quiet. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Running won't help," it said, low and smooth, like it was a whisper carried on the wind. I spun around, but no one was there. The alley was empty. I didn't wait. I ran. My feet pounded the pavement as I darted between buildings, taking turns I didn't remember. I had no clear destination, no plan, just a desperate need to escape. I was losing my mind. Was I imagining this? Was I the only one who could see them? Why was no one else reacting? I slowed down only when I reached the park near my apartment, gasping for breath. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like twisted arms, and for the first time, I felt truly alone. As I sank onto a nearby bench, I looked around just to make sure no one was following me. But there, across the path, standing by the fountain, I saw the scarred man again. He wasn't alone. The group was there, staring at me with those same cold eyes. I stood up quickly, my legs trembling. "Why are you doing this?" I called out, my voice shaking. But they didn't answer. Instead, the scarred man tilted his head, as if studying me. Slowly, deliberately, they began to walk toward me. I turned and ran again, not caring that I had no idea where I was going. I couldn't stop. My mind was screaming at me to move, to get away. I reached the street, but as I crossed, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Yet, the pressure on my shoulder remained. Something invisible was pushing down, holding me in place. I could hear the soft shuffle of feet behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like the entire world was pressing in on me. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. "This isn't real," I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. "None of this is real." But when I turned again, I saw them standing just a few feet away. Their eyes were locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. They weren't going to stop. They were never going to stop. I was trapped. I ran, but I didn't know where to. My feet moved automatically, as if my body had given up on thinking. The world around me blurred, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. The streets, the buildings, the people, they all felt distant, as if I were trapped inside a nightmare that refused to end. My mind screamed for me to escape, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming certainty that it didn't matter. They were always going to be right behind me. I turned down a narrow street, hoping for some kind of refuge, but it was no use. They were there. I didn't see them, not at first, but I could hear them. The sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, following me with perfect timing. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just empty pavement and flickering streetlights. Still, the feeling of being pursued, of being hunted, was inescapable. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out in ways they shouldn't. It wasn't normal. It couldn't be. But the longer I ran, the more convinced I became that this was no ordinary chase. It was something else, something far worse. I stumbled into a dead-end alley, my mind racing as I looked around for an escape. The walls loomed on either side of me, high and unyielding. There was no way out. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear them now, 3 distinct sets of footsteps. They were getting closer. I tried to steady my breathing, my thoughts racing in a panic. Why? Why me? And then, as though summoned by my thoughts, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the scarred man, his eyes locked on mine. The other 2 appeared beside him, the woman with dark sunglasses and the young man with the hood, their faces hidden beneath layers of shadow. They stood still, silent, like statues, but I could feel their presence pressing on me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. My mind was spinning with fear and confusion. They hadn't said a word. Why were they just standing there? "What do you want from me?" I finally managed to say, my voice cracking. The scarred man didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step toward me. I took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the woman with the sunglasses reached up and pulled them off, revealing pale eyes that seemed to pierce through me like cold steel. "You've seen us now," she said, her voice smooth, almost pleasant. "There's no turning back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Seen you? What does that even mean? Who are you? What do you want from me?" "We've been watching you," the young man spoke, his voice hollow. "For a long time." The scarred man stepped forward again, his face unreadable. "You were always meant to be part of this," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "This has been your fate." I shook my head, trembling. "No. This can't be real. You're just people. You don't control me." The woman's smile was cold, almost predatory. You misunderstand. We don't control you. We simply show you what you've always known. My head spun. What did she mean? What had I always known? Before I could say anything else, the man with the scar raised his hand, and the world around me seemed to shift. The alley, the buildings, the pavement, all of it distorted, warping like a reflection in a cracked mirror. My stomach lurched, and I staggered back, disoriented. Everything around me felt wrong. The shadows were no longer shadows. They had become something else. A movement at the corner of my eye caught my attention, and when I turned, I saw something I couldn't explain, figures moving in and out of the darkness, shapes that were both human and not. I felt a tightness in my chest, as though I were being pulled into something deeper, something darker. I tried to scream, but the sound didn't come out. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Then, the scarred man's voice cut through the chaos. This is your truth. You were always meant to be here with us, whether you knew it or not. The world shifted again, and I found myself standing in a different place, a different time. It was no longer the alley or the street. I was in a room dimly lit, but eerily familiar. And as I looked around, I realized with horror that I wasn't alone. They were all here. Every one of them. The figures. The ones who had been watching me. The people who weren't just following me, they were part of something much larger. Something I couldn't understand. And suddenly, it became clear. The group, the cult, the invisible club that had been watching me had been preparing me for something I couldn't escape. The scarred man took a step forward, his eyes locked onto mine. "Welcome to the truth," he said. And the room closed in around me. The room around me seemed to pulse, as though it had a life of its own. The walls, if they were walls, shifted in and out of focus, bending unnaturally as if they were part of a dream I couldn't wake from. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as though the very air was pressing against me, holding me in place. I looked around desperately. The figures, the ones who had been stalking me, were closer now, their faces still hidden in shadow, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They didn't speak, but I could feel them watching me, scrutinizing every breath I took. The scarred man was still in front of me, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand yet, do you?" he asked, his voice low and almost pitying. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was no escape. I was trapped in this place, this nightmare that seemed to stretch endlessly. "What is this? What do you want from me?" I forced the words out, my voice trembling. The woman with the sunglasses stepped forward, her gaze fixed on me. "You've been chosen," she said, her voice smooth and detached. "Chosen to see what others can't. Chosen to know what lies beneath the surface of the world." I stared at her, my mind struggling to comprehend what she was saying. "What do you mean?" "Chosen for what?" The young man with the hood finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Chosen to become one of us." The words hit me like a cold wave. "Become one of you?" I whispered, barely able to process what they were implying. "I don't want anything to do with you. You're crazy." The scarred man shook his head slowly. "You don't get to choose. You were always meant to be a part of this. You just didn't know it yet." I felt my heart race as the walls around me seemed to close in tighter. This can't be real," I muttered, trying to push past the panic. "This is some kind of sick joke." The woman with the sunglasses reached out and touched my arm lightly, her fingers cold against my skin. "It's not a joke," she said softly. "This has been happening for centuries. We've watched people like you, people who can see beyond the veil, who can understand what others can't. And now, it's your turn." I pulled my arm back, my breath quickening. "No. I don't want any part of this. You can't make me do this." The scarred man's lips curled into a small, almost sympathetic smile. "You're already part of it, whether you like it or not." I backed away, but my feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. The shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. My mind was racing, but all I could think of was one thing: there was no way out. "Why me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this to me?" The young man stepped forward, his face partially obscured by his hood. "You've been watched for years," he said, his voice hollow. "You've seen things, felt things others couldn't. You were always meant to be part of us. Your eyes, your mind, are the key." I tried to shake my head, but my thoughts were slipping through my fingers like sand. My mind was clouded, unable to process what they were saying. But then, a memory surfaced, something from long ago. A moment I had thought was just a dream. It was the night of my childhood, when I was alone in my room, feeling the weight of something watching me. I had seen shadows move outside my window, shapes that didn't belong. I had heard whispers in the night, voices that weren't mine. My parents had dismissed it, chalking it up to my imagination. But now, as I stood there in that suffocating room, I knew it wasn't just a dream. It had been real. They had been watching me all along. I turned to face the scarred man, my voice barely above a whisper. "I remember now. You were there, back then, watching me." His smile deepened. "We never left. We've always been here, waiting for you to see the truth." I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I tried to push the memories away, to deny them, but the truth was undeniable now. They had been here long before I had even realized it. And they weren't going to let me go. The woman with the sunglasses reached up and pulled something from her pocket. It was small, a silver medallion, inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize. She held it up before my eyes, and for a moment everything around me seemed to blur, as if the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart. "This is your truth," she said. "This is the key that unlocks your purpose." I reached out instinctively, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the medallion. The moment I touched it, something inside me shifted. The room seemed to twist, the shadows stretching and pulling, distorting in unnatural ways. I could hear whispers now, soft, urgent whispers that seemed to come from every direction. "Join us," the scarred man said again, his voice almost a command. "Become one of us, and you'll see the world for what it truly is." I wanted to scream, to fight, to tear myself away from this nightmare. But as my fingers closed around the medallion, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It was as though I had no choice anymore, as if the decision had already been made for me. And then, the truth hit me all at once. I wasn't just being watched. I was being prepared for something far worse than I could ever imagine. Something that had been waiting for me all along. And there was no turning back. The room shifted again, like the very air around me was bending, warping, stretching. The medallion pulsed in my hand, its cold surface seeping into my skin, filling my veins with an icy pressure. I tried to pull away, but my body refused to obey. The weight of the moment, of everything that had happened, pressed down on me like a vice, suffocating all the air from my lungs. The scarred man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. There was no compassion in them, no humanity. Just an empty, hollow stare that seemed to pierce through me, to see everything I had ever been, everything I had ever thought. "You've felt it," he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. "The pull, the calling. You've always known. You've just been running from it." The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, filling my head with incomprehensible murmurs. I could hear my own heartbeat, racing faster and faster as the shadows around me stretched and moved, twisting into shapes that weren't quite human, weren't quite anything at all. The room was no longer a room. It had become a place between places, a space where time no longer mattered, where the boundaries of reality seemed to fade away. I could feel the presence of them, their eyes, their unblinking gaze, pressing in from all sides. They were all around me now, moving, shifting. The figures in the shadows that had once seemed distant now closed in, their faces becoming clearer, their expressions devoid of warmth, of mercy. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, my voice shaking. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The woman with the sunglasses was the next to speak, her voice calm and almost soothing. "We've been waiting for you," she said. "Waiting for you to understand. You're not the first. We've chosen others before you. You won't be the last. This is how it has always been." I didn't understand. I couldn't. "What do you mean?" My voice was barely a whisper now, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "What's going to happen?" The young man with the hood stepped forward, his face still hidden beneath the shadows of his hood. He raised his hand, and suddenly the floor beneath my feet seemed to dissolve. I stumbled, my mind reeling as the space around me twisted once more. "You're going to join us," he said. "You're going to see everything we see. Understand everything we understand." The ground beneath me flickered, as though it was no longer solid. I felt myself being pulled into the void, a dark, empty place where nothing existed but the overwhelming sensation of falling. "You can't escape," the scarred man said, his voice fading as the shadows engulfed me. "You never could." And just like that, I was gone. At first, there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sensation. Just an endless void that stretched on forever, a place where time and space held no meaning. It was like floating in the middle of a dream, lost and untethered, with no beginning and no end. But then, slowly, shapes began to appear around me. Figures emerged from the darkness, faces I had never seen, but somehow knew. They were all around me now, moving with an eerie grace, their eyes empty, yet filled with a deep, ancient knowledge. I was no longer afraid. At least, I didn't feel fear anymore. What I felt now was something far deeper, something primal. A sense of belonging, of understanding. The figures reached out, their hands passing through me like a cold breeze. I could feel their presence inside me, their thoughts and memories melding with mine. My mind expanded, stretching beyond the confines of my body, reaching out into the unknown. And then, in an instant, I understood. This had always been my purpose. This was why I had been chosen. I had been a part of this group from the very beginning, whether I realized it or not. My life, my choices, my every move had been guided by something greater than myself. The world I had known was just a veil, a mask that concealed the truth. The truth that I was never meant to live a normal life. I was meant to see beyond it. To be one of them. I had become what I had feared the most. I had joined them. The shadows around me began to dissipate, and I found myself back in the alley, standing alone. The cold night air washed over me, but it no longer felt real. Everything around me seemed distant, unreal. I looked down at my hands. The medallion was still in my grip, its surface now warm, pulsing with life. I felt no need to question it anymore. There was no fear, no doubt. I had become part of the unseen world. And in that moment, I knew I was no longer alone. They were with me. Always. And the truth, the real truth, was that there was no escaping them. There never had been. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be lost? Completely lost, with no idea where you are or how to get out? It's one of those things we all think about, maybe when we're out in the woods or on some isolated path. But the reality of it is far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. It started as a simple trip. A weekend hike with friends in the woods just outside the town. It wasn't meant to be anything special, just a few days in nature, a break from the usual routine. We'd made plans weeks in advance, packed our bags with enough supplies, and set off early in the morning, laughing and joking like we always did. There were 5 of us: Evan, Mia, Ben, Claire, and me, Jack. We were all used to outdoor adventures, so we didn't think twice about the idea of spending a few days deep in the forest. But as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, something felt off. It wasn't a specific thing at first. Just a feeling, like the air around us had changed. The trees, which had seemed welcoming in the daylight, now looked darker, their branches more tangled and oppressive. The path we had been following for hours seemed to be slipping away under our feet, as though the forest itself was shifting, rearranging, hiding our way forward. At first, we laughed it off. "We're just disoriented," Mia said, looking at the map. "It happens." But as we continued walking, something strange happened. The map didn't seem to make sense anymore. The landmarks we were supposed to be passing were nowhere to be found. We had passed the same rocky outcrop 3 times now. I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that we weren't just lost, but being guided somewhere. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Evan, usually the calmest of us all, started glancing over his shoulder constantly, his brow furrowed. "We're not just lost. Something's wrong. We've been walking in circles." Claire tried to reassure him. "It's just the forest. You get disoriented, especially when it starts to get dark." But even she couldn't hide the nervous edge in her voice. As night began to fall, the sounds of the forest changed. The chirping of the crickets stopped. The wind that had been rustling through the leaves became still, and the world grew silent, unnervingly silent. Then came the first sound. At first, it was just a rustling in the underbrush behind us. Nothing much. But then it came again. Louder this time. A heavy, deliberate step. A footfall. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Ben, the most skeptical of us all, shrugged it off. "It's probably an animal. We're in the forest, remember?" But no one moved. We all listened. The sound wasn't like anything an animal would make. It was too purposeful, too deliberate. I took a step forward, my heart racing, and called out into the growing darkness. "Hello? Is someone out there?" But there was no answer. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. We all stood there, unsure of what to do, each of us trying to dismiss the dread creeping into our minds. "Let's just keep moving," Evan said, though I could tell he was trying to convince himself as much as the rest of us. We resumed walking, but the feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't just in our heads anymore. It felt like the trees themselves were watching us, like the very earth beneath our feet was waiting for us to make a mistake. We came across a clearing just as the last bit of light was leaving the sky. It was a welcome sight, a moment to pause and reassess. But as we stood there, looking around, I noticed something unsettling. The clearing didn't feel right. The ground was too flat, too even. The trees on the edge of the clearing seemed too perfect, their trunks too straight, their branches too evenly spaced. And then, in the center of the clearing, I saw it. A figure. Not a person, but something in the shape of a person. A shadow, standing still, watching us. My breath caught in my throat. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Evan. He looked at me, his face pale. "Yeah, I saw it too." The figure didn't move, but I could feel it staring at us, its presence like a weight pressing down on me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. We stood frozen, staring into the darkness where it had been. No one spoke. "We need to go," Mia said, her voice sharp with panic. Now. It was a moment before we even moved. We all turned, starting to head back the way we came, but the path that had been there before was gone. The trees had closed in, the ground beneath our feet was unfamiliar, and the sky overhead had changed, become darker, colder. "We're not on the right path," Claire said, her voice tight with fear. "We're not on the path at all." That was when I realized it. The forest wasn't just disorienting us. It was trapping us. The trees were closing in, the sounds around us were growing louder, and the strange sensation of being followed was unmistakable now. Something was hunting us. Something that was aware of us and didn't want us to leave. And the worst part? It wasn't just the forest that was changing. We were, too. The coldness in the air grew, biting at my skin, sending shivers through my entire body. We were walking faster now, but the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to stretch its dark arms around us. The trees had closed in even tighter, and the ground felt uneven beneath our boots. The path we had followed just moments ago now appeared to have dissolved completely. There was no sign of the familiar trail, no markers to guide us. "We need to stop," Mia said, her voice strained. "We've been walking in circles." "How do you know?" Ben snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. He, too, was starting to feel the weight of the fear in the air, even if he didn't want to admit it. I looked around at the others, Evan, who was trailing behind, staring at the ground like he was searching for something, Claire, who was nervously clutching the map, and Ben, who was pacing in agitation. "We've been going in one direction for hours," I said, my voice flat. "And now we're stuck. It's like the forest has changed while we weren't looking." There was a brief silence, each of us aware of the truth of my words, but none of us willing to say it out loud. We stopped in the middle of a small clearing. It was a brief respite from the pressing darkness, but it felt hollow, like we were being drawn into the eye of a storm. I could feel it, the weight of something unseen, something looming just out of view. "How much longer do we keep going like this?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. I could barely think straight. The atmosphere was too thick, too suffocating. The sounds that had once felt like ordinary forest noises now felt loaded with a kind of sinister intent. The rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, it all seemed to be coming from somewhere just behind us, close enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. But every time I turned, there was nothing there. "Let's just rest for a bit," Evan suggested, his voice weary. "We need to think this through." We sat down on the damp ground, huddling together. The forest pressed in, but in the silence that followed, we could hear something else, a distant, barely perceptible sound. It started as a faint rustle of leaves, far off, but then it grew closer. It sounded like someone was moving through the forest, but they were too quiet, too deliberate to be any of us. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my throat tight. The others looked at me, but no one spoke. The noise grew louder now, slow, steady footsteps. But there was something wrong with them. Too regular. Too measured. Like someone walking just outside of our vision, keeping pace with us, but never revealing themselves. Ben shifted uneasily. "It's probably an animal. Probably just a deer or something." But even as he said it, I could see the unease in his eyes. He didn't believe it any more than I did. This wasn't the sound of an animal. This was something else, something that knew exactly where we were, knew exactly how to move, and was waiting for the right moment. "We should move," Mia said, her voice low. "Now." We stood up, my legs feeling like lead as we began to walk again. But with each step, the footsteps behind us seemed to grow louder, closer. Whoever, or whatever it was right there. It felt like the ground beneath us was shifting in time with its movements, as if the entire forest was alive, aware of us, toying with us. I turned to look over my shoulder, my heart racing. But there was nothing there. Just the trees, standing tall and silent. I wanted to scream, to shout at the forest, to demand that it show us an escape. But I didn't dare. Not yet. "Let's keep moving," Evan said, his voice tight. "We'll find a way out." But his words didn't reassure me. They only made it worse. The more we walked, the more I realized that there was no escape. No way out. As we trudged deeper into the forest, the silence began to feel heavy again. The air thickened, like it was suffocating us, weighing down on our shoulders. The footsteps that had been following us, close, but never too close, had stopped. And yet, the sense of being watched didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Then, just as I thought the silence would break me, a sound shattered the stillness. A loud crash from behind us, followed by a sickening snap, like a branch breaking under the weight of something massive. We spun around, fear flooding through my veins. "Ben?" I called out. But no answer came. "Ben!" Claire cried out, panic rising in her voice. I turned fully, my breath catching in my throat. The path was empty. There was no sign of Ben. He had been right behind us just a moment ago, but now he was gone. A cold, dead silence fell over us. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. "Where did he go?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. I looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of struggle. No footprints in the damp earth. Just nothing. "Ben?" I called out again, louder this time. Still no answer. Panic gripped my chest. It wasn't just that he was gone, it was that we couldn't even tell when it happened. He had vanished without a trace, like he had been swallowed by the forest itself. "We need to find him," Evans said, his voice shaking. But I knew, deep down, that it was pointless. The forest didn't want us to find him. It didn't want us to find anything. We were being hunted, each step drawing us deeper into something that was no longer a place of nature, but something far more ancient, more sinister. "We need to leave," I said, my voice breaking. "We need to get out of here." But as I spoke the words, I knew they were pointless. We were already too far gone. We stood there in the cold, the weight of Ben's disappearance pressing down on us, and for a moment, none of us moved. No one knew what to do. I could hear the sounds of the forest again, whispers of wind rustling the leaves, the distant call of an owl, but it all felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. "Ben's gone," Mia whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We have to keep moving," Claire said, her voice breaking the silence. "We can't just stand here." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That something, or someone, was listening to us, waiting for us to make a move. We started walking again, though every step felt heavier than the last. The forest around us felt suffocating, as if it was closing in, tightening its grip on us. The trees loomed over us, casting long, twisted shadows in the dim light. The path, if you could even call it a path anymore, wound its way through the dense underbrush, but it seemed to twist and turn, never leading us where we wanted to go. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the shadows, someone, something, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty trees. I wanted to shout, to demand that this was all just a bad dream, that we were still on the path we had started on. But deep down, I knew the truth. We weren't going to wake up from this. We were trapped, and the forest knew it. The feeling of being followed had only grown stronger since Ben had disappeared. It wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real. Every crunch of a leaf underfoot, every rustle in the underbrush, felt like it was happening just behind us, like someone was right there, breathing down our necks. "Stop," Evans said suddenly, his voice harsh. "Did you hear that?" We froze. The sound had come from somewhere behind us, distant but unmistakable, a low growl, deep and guttural, like an animal warning us to stay away. It wasn't any animal I had ever heard before. It was too human, too deliberate. "Where's it coming from?" Claire whispered, her face pale. I couldn't tell. The noise seemed to echo all around us, as if the trees themselves were alive, sending the sound in every direction. "Keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to keep moving." But just as I spoke, the sound stopped. And then another noise replaced it, closer this time, a thud, like something heavy being dropped onto the forest floor. The air grew colder, and the world around us seemed to darken, as if the very sky above was being swallowed by the trees. A thick fog began to roll in, curling around our feet, blurring the edges of the path. The temperature dropped even further, making my breath visible in the air. "I don't like this," Mia said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this at all." Neither did I. My heart was racing, my pulse hammering in my ears, but I couldn't stop moving. None of us could. We were driven by fear, by the need to escape something that was closing in around us, something that we couldn't even see. The fog thickened, and I could no longer see the others clearly. I reached out for Evan's arm, but my hand passed through empty air. I gasped, spinning around, but he was gone. "Evan?" I called out, panic flooding my chest. There was no answer. The fog seemed to pull the world further into its grasp, and I was left standing alone in the center of it, unable to see anything beyond the thin mist that curled around my legs. I could hear the others, faint whispers in the distance, but I couldn't tell where they were or how far away they were. "Guys!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" Still no answer. I took a few cautious steps forward, my heart pounding, but the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. I stumbled, my foot catching on something in the dark. I reached down, feeling the rough texture of a tree root, and pulled myself up. But when I looked back, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A figure. In the distance, standing just beyond the fog, partially obscured by the mist. My breath hitched. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its silhouette dark against the pale light of the fog. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. It just stood there, watching me, its presence suffocating. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Who is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't get an answer. But as I stared at the figure, something shifted in the fog, another shape, moving in the mist, slowly, silently. It was another one, not as tall, but just as dark. A shadow, watching, waiting. Then another. And another. The figures were closing in. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. I didn't know what they were, but I knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just a forest. This was something alive. Something that wanted us here. And it wasn't letting us leave. "Guys!" I screamed again, but my voice was swallowed by the thick fog. I turned to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, and I tripped, falling to the ground. The figures, whatever they were too close now, too close to escape. And then, silence. It wasn't the usual forest silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I could feel the eyes of the forest on me. And I realized, too late, that we weren't meant to leave. The forest had already claimed us. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I lay there on the damp ground, my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to get up, to run. But I couldn't move. Not because I was paralyzed by fear, but because something inside me, deep in my bones, knew that I couldn't escape. The forest had its grip on us, and it wasn't going to let go. I forced myself to rise to my knees, the fog swirling around me like a living thing, pulling me deeper into the shadows. My thoughts were fragmented, dizzying. Where was everyone? I tried to call out, but my voice barely made a sound. It was as if the air itself was thickening, swallowing the words before they could leave my mouth. Suddenly, a noise broke through the stillness, a soft rustling, like footsteps in the underbrush. My head whipped toward the sound, but the fog was so dense I could barely see past my outstretched hands. The shape of a person emerged from the mist, stumbling forward with slow, labored steps. I blinked, disbelief clouding my vision. It was Evan. "Evan?" I gasped, rushing forward, my legs shaky beneath me. He didn't answer. His face was pale, almost sickly, his eyes wide with terror, but there was something wrong with him. His clothes were torn, his body covered in scratches and bruises, as though he had been dragged through the underbrush, but his movements were slow, deliberate, like he wasn't fully in control of his own body. "Evan, what happened to you?" I asked, reaching out, but he didn't seem to notice me. He kept walking, his steps hollow, distant, as if he were in some kind of trance. Then, Without warning, he collapsed to the ground, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. I knelt beside him, frantic, shaking his shoulder. "Evan, can you hear me?" He didn't respond. His eyes were wide open, but they were glazed over, unfocused, as though he was staring at something far beyond me, something that I couldn't see. And then I heard it, the same growl from earlier. This time, it was closer, much closer. The sound seemed to vibrate through my bones, sending waves of dread crashing over me. It was coming from all around us, a deep, guttural growl that echoed through the fog. I backed away from Evan, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Something was wrong with him. He wasn't himself. He had changed. I didn't want to leave him, but I couldn't stay. Not with that sound closing in, not with whatever was out there, watching, waiting for its moment. As I backed away, the fog parted slightly, and I saw something else. A figure. Not just one, but several dark, shadowy shapes standing just beyond the edge of the mist. They were tall, distorted, their features impossible to make out, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The growl came again, louder now, closer. The figures moved, shifting, circling, like predators surrounding their prey. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me through the thickening fog, my breath ragged in my chest. I couldn't see where I was going, couldn't see anything but the swirling, oppressive mist around me. But I kept running, my feet pounding against the ground, desperate to escape. Behind me, I could hear the figures following. The growls grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear the rustling of branches, the heavy footfalls of something larger than human, something unnatural. I had no idea how far I had run, or for how long, but when I finally slowed down, the fog seemed to have thinned. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. My heart sank as I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The trees here were different, older, twisted, as if they had been standing for centuries. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. I had no idea where the others were. I didn't know if I'd ever see them again. The fog was still there, though, swirling around my feet. And then, just as I thought I might be safe, I heard it again. The growl. It was closer this time. And as I turned to face it, a figure emerged from the mist. A tall, dark shape, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, waiting. And then another shape appeared, this one smaller, more hunched, moving in a way that was unnatural, almost insect-like. It was followed by another, and another, until they were all around me, shadowy figures, circling, closing in. I tried to stand, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very air around me was holding me in place, rooting me to the spot. A voice, low, guttural, whispered from the darkness. "Stay with us." I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the figure, tall, towering, stepping closer, its eyes gleaming with something ancient, something hungry. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I wasn't sure where I was. The fog had lifted, but the world around me felt strange. The trees were still towering, their branches twisted and knotted like the gnarled fingers of some ancient creature. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the ground beneath me was soft, like the forest floor had become some kind of thick, spongy carpet. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Everything else was silent. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as though I was still trapped in the fog, unable to escape. My limbs were stiff, my muscles aching from running, from fear. I forced myself to sit up, squinting into the dim light filtering through the trees. But there was no sign of anyone. No sign of the others. Had I been dreaming? Had everything that had happened been some twisted nightmare? But as I looked around, I knew deep down that it wasn't a dream. The forest was alive. And it was watching me. The figures were gone, but the sense of their presence lingered in the air. The trees creaked in the wind, their branches swaying like they were moving, like they were reaching for me. I could feel their eyes on me, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't alone. I was never alone here. I forced myself to stand, my legs weak beneath me, and took a cautious step forward. The path was still there, winding through the trees, but it felt different now. It didn't feel like a path that would lead me out of the forest. It felt like a path that would lead me deeper into it. I didn't know how much time had passed since the figures had surrounded me, but it felt like hours, maybe even days. I had to find the others. I had to know if they were still alive. I stumbled forward, my feet dragging through the thick underbrush, but the further I walked, the more I began to doubt whether I would ever find them. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees bending, twisting, as if the very ground was alive, moving, changing. I couldn't keep track of the direction I was heading. I couldn't remember how many times I had turned, how many times the path had doubled back on itself, leading me in circles. It wasn't just the fog anymore, it was the trees themselves, the forest, that was changing, warping. The deeper I went, the more I felt its presence, the more I felt like it was pulling me in. The growls came again. But this time, they were different. They weren't just growls. They were voices. Faint, whispering voices, so faint I almost couldn't hear them. But I did hear them. And I knew they weren't human. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. The voices were distant at first, barely a whisper, but then they grew louder, and I could make out words. "Join us," one voice hissed. "Stay with us." It wasn't Evan. It wasn't Mia or Claire. It was something else, something older, something that had been in this forest for far longer than any of us. It was calling me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by something that was older than time itself. The voices were everywhere now, swirling around me, drawing closer, their whispers like fingers brushing my skin. And then I heard another sound. A footstep. It was a soft, slow step, but it was unmistakable. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees and the mist that seemed to roll in thicker with each passing second. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it again, that presence, that watching, waiting feeling. The growls rose, louder now, more insistent, and I knew they were closing in on me. The figures were coming back. And this time, there would be no escape. I ran again, blindly, stumbling over the roots and rocks, but the forest seemed to shift around me, its path leading me deeper, farther from where I had started. The growls followed, just behind me, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could see them, those dark figures, shadows that moved and shifted in the mist, always just out of reach. I could feel my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. Not now. Not after everything. But then the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into a pit, the earth giving way beneath my feet, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I was weightless. And then I hit the ground hard, my body slamming against the earth. I lay there, dazed, my head spinning, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But then I heard the voices again. They were closer now. They were all around me, surrounding me, closing in. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that I was never going to leave this forest. The darkness swallowed me, and the last thing I heard was a whisper, so soft, so cold. "Welcome home." It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Just a small break from the hectic routine, a few days to disconnect and recharge. I found the perfect place, a secluded house nestled in the woods, a charming little cottage with old stone walls, a cozy fireplace, and an enormous backyard that stretched into the forest. It looked like something out of a dream. The reviews were perfect, and the host's description promised peace and quiet, exactly what I was looking for. But when I arrived, things felt off. The house was beautiful, there was no denying that. The floors creaked under my feet, and the air had a strange mustiness, as if the house hadn't been touched in years, yet everything was well maintained. There was an eerie calmness to it, a stillness that almost felt unnatural. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. The host, a man named Thomas, had left me a note on the kitchen counter. I unfolded it and read, "Welcome to my home. I hope you enjoy your stay. There are just a few rules. Do not go into the basement. Do not open the door to the attic. Do not leave your room after midnight. These rules are important. I hope you understand." I frowned as I read through the instructions again. The note seemed odd, especially the last one. "Don't leave my room after midnight?" It was such a strange request. But perhaps it was just part of the house's charm, like some old superstition. I decided to ignore it and get settled in. The evening passed uneventfully. I made a simple dinner, read a book by the fireplace, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. But as the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had the distinct sense that I wasn't alone. It was like the house was waiting. The silence felt thick, as if something was lurking just beyond my awareness, hidden in the corners of the house. At about 11:30, I stood up to stretch and decided to take a walk around the house. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. The air felt colder than before, and I wrapped my sweater tighter around myself. As I passed the staircase leading to the upper floor, I noticed something strange, a faint light flickering beneath the door to the attic. It hadn't been on before. I hesitated for a moment, my mind flicking back to the note Thomas had left. The attic. I wasn't supposed to go up there. But curiosity gnawed at me. I walked past the door, telling myself I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to break the rule. That was when I heard the sound. A soft scrape. I froze. It came from upstairs. A slow, deliberate scraping noise. I glanced toward the staircase, where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The house was suddenly unnervingly still again. There was no more creaking from the floors, no more wind outside, just that soft, chilling scrape. Without thinking, I turned around and walked back to the hallway. I didn't know why, but something told me to go upstairs. Something told me the attic door was calling me. The feeling intensified with every step I took. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced. I had to stop this. I had to go back to my room. But I didn't. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The light behind it was flickering, casting strange shadows across the walls. For a split second, I thought I saw something moving beyond the crack in the door, something tall and thin, just out of view. And then, the scraping sound stopped. I hesitated. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe I was imagining things. I slowly turned the doorknob. The door creaked open. The smell hit me first, cold, damp, and musty, like old, forgotten things. The attic was a small, cramped space, and it smelled as though nothing had been up here for years. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I stepped inside, compelled by something I couldn't explain. I turned on the light, illuminating the attic's shadowy corners. The light flickered and buzzed, casting long shadows that seemed to move just slightly too fast, too unnaturally. Boxes were stacked in the corners, covered in dust, and old furniture stood against the walls, forgotten relics from years past. And then I saw it. In the far corner, there was something new, something that hadn't been there when I arrived. A figure, crouched in the corner. Its body was unnaturally thin, its limbs long and twisted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent. It was hunched over, its back arched at an impossible angle, and it was staring at me with eyes that reflected no light. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. And then it moved. Slowly, it tilted its head to the side, its eyes never leaving mine. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The house seemed to close in on me, its walls growing tighter, the air thicker. The figure started to crawl toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was dragging itself across the floor. That was when I remembered the third rule. Do not leave your room after midnight. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to escape, to get away from whatever that thing was. I bolted down the hallway, but as I passed the staircase, I heard it again. The scrape. Only this time, it was louder. Closer. It was coming after me. I reached my room and slammed the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of scraping was growing louder, and I knew, deep down, that it was too late. I had broken the rule. And now, there was no escape. I pressed my back against the door, my hand gripping the knob as if I could somehow keep it shut with my own strength. My heart was pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything else except for that awful scraping sound, now unmistakably coming from the floor above. It was slow, deliberate, like something dragging itself across the wood. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room had thickened, pressing down on me with a weight that was unbearable. I strained to hear, to catch even the slightest sound beyond the door. But all I could hear was that scraping. It wasn't just moving anymore, it was getting closer. A faint, echoing sound of something shifting, then a knock at the door. I jumped. Not a knock like someone's knuckles tapping, but a tap that seemed to reverberate in my bones. It was soft, but with a power behind it that made it impossible to ignore. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, standing there, trembling. The knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. And then, to my horror, the door handle turned. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly backed away, pressing myself into the corner of the room, desperately searching for an escape. The window? The window was too small. There was no way I could fit through that. The door creaked, the metal of the doorknob turning as though someone, or something, was trying to get in. I felt the air shift as the door began to inch open. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let whatever was on the other side get to me. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and swung it wildly toward the door. The glass shattered, and for a moment, the sound echoed through the room, louder than the scraping. The door jerked back as if startled by the force of the blow. I didn't wait to see if it would open further. I dashed across the room, my breath ragged in my chest, my feet slipping on the wooden floor as I reached for the door leading to the hallway. I yanked it open and bolted into the corridor. The house was so much darker now. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder with every step I took. The once quiet house now seemed alive, filled with the sounds of creaking, groaning, and whispers I couldn't quite make out. I needed to find a way out. I needed to find the front door. But I wasn't sure which direction I was running in. Everything looked the same, the walls, the doors, the same endless hallway stretching on and on. Then, I heard it again. A soft scraping, like fingernails on wood. It was behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I could hear it getting closer, the sound growing louder and faster, like it was chasing me, following me. I didn't know how, but I could feel it. That thing was right there, just behind me. I turned a corner and nearly crashed into the wall. The house seemed to twist and distort, the layout not matching what I remembered. How had I passed that hallway already? How was everything shifting? I glanced over my shoulder just for a moment. It was there. The figure, pale and contorted, with its limbs dragging across the floor. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes reflecting no light. It was crawling toward me with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, its body bending and breaking in ways that no human body could. It reached out, its fingers twitching toward me, almost like they were longing to touch me. I ran faster, pushing my legs harder, the fear building inside me like a tidal wave. But the house kept shifting. The doors seemed to lead into other rooms I didn't recognize. It felt like I was running in circles. And then I saw it. The staircase. I had to get to the front door, I thought, but the staircase was right there in front of me, and I could hear it moving, closer now, the scraping louder than ever. I ran for it. Each step felt like it took more energy than the last. The stairs creaked under my feet, as if the house itself was protesting my every move. But I couldn't stop now. I had to get away. I had to leave. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in front of me. The front door was at the far end, but it felt so far away, like it wasn't meant to be reached. I sprinted, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but when I reached the door, I felt a cold rush of panic. The door was gone. In its place was another door, one I didn't recognize. I turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I turned around. It was there. The figure, now standing at the bottom of the stairs, its long, bony fingers scraping against the wood as it slowly ascended. The hallway stretched behind it, and I could see something shifting in the shadows, something far larger than the figure in front of me. The house was alive. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I was paralyzed, caught in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The figure reached the top of the stairs. It stopped for a moment, its head tilting in a way that made my stomach churn. And then it spoke. Its voice was like the creaking of old wood, low and distorted, barely more than a whisper. Why did you break the rules? I couldn't answer. I was frozen, my mind screaming, but nothing coming out. The figure took a step toward me, its limbs twisting in ways that no human body could. And then, as if something from deep inside the house made a decision, the figure lunged. I barely had time to react. The figure lunged at me with terrifying speed, its elongated fingers reaching for me, its twisted body propelling it forward in a grotesque, jerking motion. I stumbled backward, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. My vision blurred for a moment, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to get away. I forced myself to move, pushing against the wall to get back on my feet, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I glanced down the hallway. There was no escape. The walls were closing in, and the figure was coming for me, its twisted form moving with unnatural speed, dragging itself toward me like a nightmare come to life. Please, I gasped, stumbling backward. My voice sounded strange, hollow, as if the house itself was swallowing my words. Please, let me go. But it didn't stop. The thing in front of me didn't even flinch at my plea. It just kept coming, its head lolling at that sickening angle, its empty eyes locked onto mine. I could hear the scrape of its limbs against the floor, each movement sending chills down my spine. It was too fast. Too fast for me to outrun. Too fast for me to think. I turned to flee again, my breath coming in ragged bursts, but as I bolted down the hallway, the air around me grew thick. The house seemed to shift, its once familiar layout becoming more foreign with every step I took. The walls closed in tighter, the doors warped and bent as if the house was mocking me. I could feel it. The house was alive. It was aware of me, watching me, controlling my every movement. The floorboards creaked beneath me, the sound of my frantic footsteps now blending with something else, a low, drawn-out growl that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the house. I froze, straining to hear. It was closer. I turned quickly to look behind me, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something standing at the end of the hallway. Something tall, its shape outlined in the dim light. But when I blinked, it was gone. Was I imagining things? Was the fear starting to get to me? I didn't have time to question it. The figure was still coming, its movement relentless and precise, and I was running out of time. I had to find a way out, but the house kept shifting, twisting, rearranging. Every time I thought I saw the door or the stairs leading down, they were gone, replaced by more corridors, more doors. The walls seemed to pulsate, like they were breathing. I reached the end of the hallway, panting, my hands slick with sweat. My eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could help me escape. And that's when I saw it. A door. Not the same one I had passed earlier, the one that wouldn't open, but this one was different. It was solid, unmarked, and strangely inviting amidst the chaos. It was a chance. I rushed toward it, my hand shaking as I grabbed the doorknob. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if it would be locked, too. But no! The door opened. I stepped through, relief flooding my body as I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. My heart still pounded in my chest, my breathing ragged as I backed away from the door, unsure of what I would find next. The room was eerily silent. The only sound was the steady rhythm of my breathing and the faint hum of the house's unnatural energy. I turned slowly, looking around. The room was sparsely furnished, just a small table and a chair in the center, some bookshelves lined with dusty old books, and a large, faded rug that covered the floor. but something felt off about it. Something wasn't right. As I moved further into the room, my eyes caught a glimpse of something on the wall, a framed photograph. I stepped closer to examine it, my hand hovering above it, almost afraid to touch. It was a picture of the house. But it wasn't like this. In the photograph, the house was pristine, untouched by time or the decay that had crept into its bones. But the thing that caught my eye wasn't the house itself. It was the figure standing in front of it. The same twisted figure I had seen earlier. I recoiled, a cold shiver running through my spine. The face in the photograph was distorted, like a warped reflection of something human, and its eyes were just as empty, just as lifeless as the one that had been chasing me. I backed away from the photograph, my mind racing. Was this place a trap? Was I always meant to find it? To stay here forever? The scrape of claws on the wooden floor snapped me from my thoughts. The figure was close. I ran for the door, but before I could reach it, the lights flickered and went out. Complete darkness. I stood frozen, the silence deafening around me. I could hear the faint sound of breathing now, heavy, labored breaths that didn't belong to me. Something was in the room with me. Something was watching me. And then, I heard the whisper. It was soft at first, a barely audible murmur. But then it grew louder, clearer, until it filled my mind, suffocating me with its words. You shouldn't have broken the rules. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. It was there, standing in the corner of the room. The figure. But now it wasn't alone. More shadows emerged from the darkness, figures indistinct and shifting, their forms melding with the walls as if the house itself was swallowing them whole. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if they were pressing in on me, suffocating me, their cold presence invading my very soul. I was trapped. And I understood, in that moment, that the house had no intention of letting me leave. I could barely move. My limbs felt like they were made of stone, my body frozen in terror as the shadows pressed closer. The figures, if they could even be called that, seemed to dissolve into the darkness around me, their shapes ever shifting, their presence undeniable. They were everywhere now, but I couldn't make out their details, couldn't find a face or form to focus on. The whispering grew louder, each word like a cold blade against my skin, each syllable slicing through the air with malicious intent. You shouldn't have broken the rules. You shouldn't have come here. The voice wasn't just one, it was many. Echoes from all directions, filling the room, curling into my mind like a sickness I couldn't shake. The sound was almost hypnotic, drowning me in an oppressive wave of dread, a heavy weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Why? Why didn't you listen? The question seemed to come from all around me, vibrating the very walls. The house has been waiting for you. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could feel the chill crawl up my spine, my breath fogging in the air like smoke. I reached out, feeling my way along the wall, hoping to find an escape, but the shadows moved with me. They slid across the surface like liquid, blocking my path, closing in on me as I backed away, desperate to find the door again. But there was no door. I turned around in a frantic panic, searching for any way out. The room had shifted. It was no longer the small, dimly lit space I had entered. It had grown, the walls stretching into an endless abyss. The bookshelves seemed to lean toward me, their pages flipping on their own, whispering words I couldn't understand. The rug had turned dark, soaked through with something that looked disturbingly like blood, and the air stank of mildew and rot. I was in a nightmare, and the worst part was that I knew it was real. You should have listened, the voices whispered again, now more insistent, more mocking. Now, you'll never leave. The sound of claws scraping against the wooden floor came again, louder this time. It was moving toward me. No, it wasn't just one. There were several of them, their footsteps overlapping, drawing nearer with each passing second. I had to move. There was no time to think. No time to wonder if I could make it. I had to get out of this house, no matter what. With every ounce of strength I had left, I ran forward, my hands outstretched, feeling the walls, the shelves, the air itself pushing against me. But the floor beneath me seemed to shift, to pull at my feet, trying to trip me, to slow me down. It was like the house didn't want me to escape, as if it was alive, breathing, and it was using every trick to keep me inside. I couldn't breathe. I ran blindly into the darkness, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The shadows swirled around me, and I could hear the soft, wet drag of something moving along the floor behind me, following me. It was so close now, I could almost feel it, its presence suffocating, suffusing the very air. Suddenly, a door materialized in front of me, an old wooden door, cracked and worn, as if it had been there all along. I threw myself at it, grabbing the doorknob with trembling hands. It turned, creaking loudly, as if the house itself was protesting my escape. I shoved the door open and stumbled into the next room, my heart racing in my chest. The room was dark, but I could see the outlines of furniture, chairs, a small table, and a window. A window. I rushed toward it, my mind on nothing but getting outside. I pulled the window open with all my strength, ignoring the broken glass that cut into my palms as I hoisted myself up. The cool night air hit my face, and I breathed it in, a sharp relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the house. But as I pulled myself through the window, my feet hit the ground with a sickening thud, and I realized I wasn't outside. I was still inside. I spun around in a panic. The same room. The same dark corners. The same oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. My heart sank. I had never left. I was still trapped, but now, I knew it wasn't just the house that had been waiting for me. It was them, the things, the figures, the shadows, whatever they were waiting for me, too. And they had been waiting for a long time. I stumbled back toward the window, but it was already closing by itself. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me again, but this time I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to know what was getting closer. I reached for the door, but before I could touch it, it opened on its own. And there they were. The figures, standing just outside the threshold, their shapes now more defined, more solid. Their eyes locked onto mine, empty but burning with hunger. "You were warned," they whispered in unison, their voices all around me. "Now, you will stay. Forever." I froze. The figures in the doorway were not just shadows now. They were solid, standing tall and unblinking. Their faces were a blurred distortion, shifting between 1,000 different shapes, none of them human. Their eyes, hollow and deep, reflected the dim light from the room, glowing with an unnatural intensity. They weren't speaking anymore, not in words. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough. I backed away slowly, instinctively, but every step I took felt wrong, like the ground was uneven or shifting beneath me. The room seemed to warp around them, as though the walls were folding in, tightening, constricting, making it harder for me to breathe. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me in that room. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down, thick and suffocating. I was stuck. Then I realized something. The house, the place I had rented, wasn't just a house. It was something else. Something far older. A place built to trap, to feed, to hold, and I had walked right into its clutches. I turned back to face the figures. They hadn't moved, but their gaze felt like it was peeling me apart, layer by layer. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as though the house had stolen the will from me, leaving me a puppet of its twisted designs. One of the figures stepped forward, its body distorting as it moved, like a piece of paper caught in a breeze, bending and rippling unnaturally. The others followed. I could hear their footsteps, wet and uneven, echoing in the silent room. "You've seen the price," it said, its voice a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once, "and now you'll pay it." I tried to move, to get away, but I was paralyzed. Every muscle in my body locked in place. The figure loomed over me, its face no longer a blur but a twisted mockery of a human form, eyes too wide, mouth too large, stretching unnaturally. It grinned, and I could feel my stomach churn. "You should have listened," it whispered, its voice now a hiss. "You think you can break the rules without consequence? The house remembers. It always remembers." The room around me seemed to warp again, the walls stretching, twisting, as if the house itself was alive, suffocating me, pulling me into its depths. I reached out, desperate for an escape, but it was no use. The space around me became infinite, stretching further and further, until there was nothing but darkness. The house was pulling me into its very core, its heart. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my chest, and I gasped. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, something that reached into my soul. I looked down, expecting to see blood, but there was nothing. Only a growing blackness, like ink spreading through the air, swirling around me, engulfing me. The figures moved closer, their eyes now burning with an intensity that made my entire body ache. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their forms beginning to distort even further. And then, without warning, I was falling. The world spun around me in a blur of dark colors, flashes of light, and distant whispers that seemed to grow louder, more frantic. I couldn't stop myself. I was falling into the depths of something unknown, something ancient. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the endless void. There was no escape. I don't know how long I fell. Time lost all meaning. It could have been hours, days, or mere seconds. But eventually, I hit something solid. I woke up. I didn't know where I was. The air was thick and cold, suffocating. My body ached all over, and when I tried to move, my limbs felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dark, and saw a familiar sight, dim light streaming through a window, the same worn wallpaper, the same dusty shelves. I was back in the house. The very same house. But something was wrong. The door to the room stood wide open. I hadn't opened it. And when I looked around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were no figures, no shadows watching me. But there was something far worse. The house was empty. Completely empty. It wasn't the same house anymore. It was now a prison, a place where nothing moved, where time had ceased to exist. The silence was unbearable, the kind of silence that presses against your skin and crawls into your bones. And then I understood. I had broken the rules. And now, I was a part of it, just like all the others who had come before me. I had become one of the ghosts that haunted the house. The rental was for them, and I would never leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was one of those instincts that gnawed at you from the inside and that you couldn't quite scratch. It had started with the letter. I found it tucked neatly between the bills and junk mail, its elegant, cream-colored envelope standing out in stark contrast to the usual clutter. The handwriting was delicate, the ink dark and flowing, forming the words with an almost unnatural precision. Join us for a night to remember. The invitation for a party arrived without any explanation. No return address, no sender. Just a date, a time, and the location, 42 Ashbury Lane. It seemed wrong. I couldn't place why, but my gut told me this wasn't something I should ignore. At first, I thought about throwing it out. A prank, maybe? Or perhaps an advertising stunt I hadn't heard about. But something about the way it was worded, the promise of a night to remember, struck a chord with me. It was almost alluring. After a moment's hesitation, I decided to check out the address. I had nothing else planned for the evening. The night felt too still, too empty. Maybe it was a sign, I thought. I didn't realize then how much I would regret that decision. I grabbed my coat and set out. Ashbury Lane was just on the edge of town. A street I had driven by countless times, yet I had never noticed any particular houses there. The houses were spaced far apart, their designs dated and overgrown with ivy. The entire area felt as though it had been left behind by time itself. As I approached number 42, I felt my heart rate quicken. There it was, an old Victorian house. Tall, looming, and dark. It seemed out of place here, on a street where every other house looked like it had been abandoned for years. There was something unsettling about it. The windows were dark, curtains drawn tight, and the garden overrun with weeds. It felt like it had been untouched for decades. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the iron gate that creaked in the wind. The invitation had said to arrive at 8 p.m., and I was right on time. But as I stood there, a sense of unease gripped me. The house felt wrong. But what made it worse was that I couldn't pinpoint why. It was as if the house itself was aware of my presence, waiting for me. The door opened before I could even reach the knocker. A tall man stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark suit, his face expressionless. His eyes seemed to glint in the dim light as he regarded me with a cold, distant gaze. "Welcome," he said simply, his voice low and monotone. I blinked, taken aback by the suddenness of his greeting. Thanks. I'm here for the party?" He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Please, come in. We've been expecting you." I stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and something else I couldn't quite place, something musty, like a damp attic. The hallway was dim, lit only by a few flickering candles placed sporadically along the walls. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I made my way in, the silence pressing in around me. The man didn't speak again. He simply turned, walking down the hallway without looking back. I followed him, feeling the weight of the silence grow heavier with every step. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me as we moved deeper into its heart. The place felt wrong. There was no music, no laughter, no signs of a party. Just that heavy silence. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floorboards and the occasional rustling of paper. As we walked further, I noticed that the wallpaper on the walls had started to peel, revealing the faded remnants of old, forgotten patterns beneath. We stopped at a door at the end of the hall. The man turned to me, his expression still unreadable. "Everyone is waiting for you," he said quietly. "Go in." My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't explain why, but the words felt wrong. Everyone is waiting for you. What did that mean? Who were these people? And why was I the only one here? Before I could ask any of these questions, the door opened slowly. I stepped forward into the unknown. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. It was spacious, but the oppressive darkness in the corners made it feel smaller than it actually was. There were no windows, just thick, velvet curtains drawn shut. The faint scent of something metallic lingered in the air, and for a moment, I wondered if I had stepped into an old crypt. I stepped inside cautiously, the floor beneath me creaking with each step. The man who had led me here didn't follow. He simply stood in the doorway, his silhouette a shadow against the dim light behind him. "Go on," he said quietly, his voice a mere whisper in the stillness. I hesitated, but then took another step forward. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed the table at the center of the room. It was covered in a fine white cloth, though the starkness of it seemed unsettling. There were no chairs, only a collection of tall, ornate candlesticks placed symmetrically around the table, their flames flickering with an unnatural light. And then I saw them. Sitting around the table were 5 people. At least, they looked like people. Their faces were covered, obscured by shadows, yet I could feel their gazes upon me. Each figure was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, black suits and dresses that appeared to have been plucked from another era. A chill ran through me as I realized they were all perfectly still, as though frozen in time. "Please, sit," came a voice from the far end of the table, the tone smooth but cold. I looked over my shoulder, but the door had closed behind me, and the man was gone. The silence grew more pronounced, thickening the air around me. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to the edge of the table where an empty chair awaited. I hesitated before sitting down, instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But what was there to leave to? The house had swallowed me whole, and now I was caught in its grip. I sat down, my hands trembling as I placed them on my lap, trying to steady myself. There was no immediate conversation. The figures around the table didn't speak, and neither did I. Instead, the seconds stretched on, becoming minutes, and I began to feel the weight of their presence more than the heaviness of the room itself. The silence between us seemed endless. "You'll understand soon enough," the voice said. "But first, you must pay the price." I furrowed my brow, a feeling of dread rising in my chest. What price? The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the candle flames flickering violently as though the room itself were alive. The figures around the table didn't answer. Instead, they all simultaneously turned their heads to face the wall behind me. I swallowed hard, my skin crawling. My instinct was to stand up and run, but something in me, a deep, primal fear, kept me rooted to the chair. I had no idea what was going on, but it was clear now that whatever I was involved in was beyond anything I could have imagined. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. A chill spread over my skin, prickling my arms, and I shivered uncontrollably. I looked over my shoulder at the wall behind me, but the darkness there was overwhelming. There was something about it, something that felt wrong. And then I saw it. A shadow moved along the wall, stretching unnaturally long, as if it were a living thing. It wasn't cast by any of the figures around the table. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was something else, something that shouldn't be. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The figures at the table didn't react, but the temperature in the room continued to drop, and I could hear a faint whisper now, like a voice speaking from the darkness itself. The shadow shifted again, this time closer, as though it were creeping toward me. And then, as if in response to the unspoken question in my mind, the voice from the far end of the table spoke again. "You shouldn't have come," it said. "Now you're part of the ritual." The room felt smaller now, suffocating. I tried to stand, but my legs refused to cooperate. My body felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding me down. The shadow stretched further, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, but undeniably present. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Something was coming. Something had been waiting for me. The shadow finally reached the edge of the table, and for the first time, the figures around me moved. Slowly, deliberately, they stood. Their faces were still obscured, but their eyes, those cold, empty eyes, locked onto mine. I was trapped. There was no escape now. The room had grown darker, despite the flickering candlelight that still fought to illuminate the space. The figures around the table, now standing, seemed to tower over me. Their presence felt suffocating, each step they took in unison sending a shiver through the air. The shadow that had crawled along the wall remained, now stretching out like a living, breathing entity. I couldn't see its form clearly, but I could feel it moving, shifting, like it was alive, waiting for something. "Why am I here?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The figure at the far end of the table, the one whose voice had haunted me since I entered, stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, its shadow merging with the growing darkness around me. As it moved, the others followed in sync, and they circled around me like wolves closing in on their prey. "You are here because you broke the rules," the voice responded, low and cold. "And now, the price must be paid." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the walls of the room closing in around me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body was frozen, as if held in place by invisible chains. I tried to call out, but no words would come. "You were invited to join us," the figure continued, its face still hidden, but its words cutting through the silence like a knife. "This place has called you, and you have answered." I looked around, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing about it made sense. The room, the figures, the shadow. It all felt wrong, unreal, like I had wandered into a nightmare that wouldn't let me wake up. The candles flickered again, the shadows growing longer, and the air grew colder. I could see my breath now, misting in front of me like a sign that something unnatural was at work here. The figure closest to me moved, its footsteps silent but heavy. It leaned down, and I could feel its cold presence like a breath on my skin. "You've entered a world you do not understand," it whispered, and I could almost feel its fingers brushing against my neck. "And now you are part of the ritual." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What ritual? What do you want from me?" There was a moment of silence, and then a terrible, bone-chilling laugh filled the room. It echoed off the walls, hollow and distant, as if coming from a place far deeper than this room. The figures did not speak. They simply moved in closer, their cold eyes watching me, waiting. I could feel the air shift again, and the darkness at the edges of the room seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, feeding off the fear that gripped me. The shadow that had been moving along the wall now began to take shape, twisting, contorting, until it stood before me, no longer a mere shadow, but something tangible, something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, towering over me, its form indistinct, a void of darkness that seemed to swallow the very light around it. Its presence was suffocating, and the room seemed to close in on itself. "Do you understand now?" The voice from the figure at the far end of the table said, its tone thick with malice. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice barely a whisper. What is this? This is your reckoning, it replied. The price you must pay for breaking the rules. The shadow before me reached out, its hand, a mass of shifting darkness, stretching toward my face. It was like a force, an overwhelming pull, dragging me closer to it, despite my attempts to pull away. I was suffocating, drowning in darkness. And then, as the shadow's fingers brushed against my face, a voice in my head screamed, "Run!" Without thinking, I surged forward, breaking free from the oppressive grip of the darkness. The room seemed to twist around me, the walls warping, the candles flickering violently. I ran, blindly, into the unknown. The door behind me was gone. The walls closed in, the floor buckling beneath my feet as if the house itself were shifting, warping into something new. The figures were gone now, but their presence lingered in the very air, in the ground beneath me. I stumbled, my feet tangling in the darkness, and I felt something sharp against my skin, a scrape, a cut, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't breathe. "Please, help me." I cried out, but the words felt hollow, lost in the overwhelming silence. The room was gone. The house was gone. I didn't know where I was anymore, only that I had to escape, that I had to leave. But the darkness followed me. It was all around me, creeping into my skin, suffocating me. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was over. I was standing in the street again, the cool night air rushing past me, the city lights casting their pale glow onto the pavement. The house was gone. The figures were gone. It was as if none of it had ever existed. But I knew better. The invitation, the house, the ritual. It hadn't ended. It was still there, waiting for me. And I would never be free. I stood there, in the middle of the street, disoriented, gasping for breath. The city around me felt too loud, too bright, too real, but I knew, deep down, that I hadn't escaped. I hadn't truly left. The terror of the night clung to me like a cold, invisible hand. I didn't know how long I stood there, trying to piece together what had happened. The shadows, the figures, the ritual. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't wake from. But the burning sensation on my skin, the chill creeping through my bones, told me that it was all too real. I tried to walk, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Every step felt like wading through thick fog. The world around me blurred, and the familiar streets of my neighborhood became something foreign, something hostile. I reached into my pocket for my phone, my hands trembling as I pulled it out. I needed to call someone, anyone. I dialed the first number that came to mind, my friend Ryan. It rang once, then twice, and on the third ring, the call went to voicemail. I cursed under my breath and hung up. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. That's when I saw it. My reflection in the store window across the street was wrong. The image staring back at me was familiar, but there was something off about it. My face seemed pale, my eyes too wide, too distant. And then I saw it, on my neck, just beneath my jawline, a mark. A dark bruise-like stain that looked as though it had been burned into my skin. It was jagged, irregular, like a symbol, an ancient, twisted shape. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. What was it? How had it gotten there? I touched it cautiously, half expecting it to burn me, but the sensation was cold, numb. It didn't hurt, but it felt wrong, unnatural, like it didn't belong on my skin. I turned away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to get home. I needed to find answers. The walk back was a blur. The streets seemed unfamiliar now, even though I had walked them 1,000 times before. I could hear the faint sounds of footsteps behind me, just barely audible over the hum of the city. I turned, but no one was there. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting over my shoulder, but nothing was out of the ordinary. I was alone. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was beginning to set. The warm glow of the evening light did little to ease the sense of dread that had settled in my gut. I pushed open the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I walked over to the bathroom mirror, my hands shaking as I reached for the sink. I had to look again. I had to see the mark up close. But as I stared at my reflection, my heart stopped. The mark on my neck, it wasn't there anymore. I ran my fingers over the skin, desperate, but there was no trace of it. Nothing. I stood frozen, staring at myself in disbelief. I wasn't imagining it. I saw it. I felt it. And then the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped, and the silence grew oppressive. I heard the faintest creak from behind me, a sound so subtle I could almost convince myself it was nothing, but I knew better. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The hallway was dark, the lights dimmed as if the room itself were holding its breath. And then, standing at the far end of the hall, just inside the doorway to the living room, was a figure. I froze. It was one of them. The shadow. The figure from the house. It stood motionless, its face obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes, those cold, empty eyes, staring right at me. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, thick with a presence that wasn't supposed to be there. My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of twisted dream, one where I was powerless, unable to escape. The figure didn't speak, didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, as if waiting. Waiting for what? I wanted to turn away, to hide, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Slowly, the figure raised one hand, and in the dim light, I could see the faint outline of something clutched in its grasp, a letter. My letter. With a tremor in my voice, I forced myself to speak. What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer, but I felt the chill in the air grow even more intense. And then, the voice that had haunted me before, cold and hollow, echoed through the room. You should not have come. The words sent a jolt of panic through me. I turned to run, but before I could take a single step, the world around me began to fade, the walls of my apartment warping, shifting, as if the very reality I had known was crumbling away. I felt myself being pulled back, as though the darkness itself was reaching for me, dragging me into its depths. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the force released me, and I collapsed onto the floor. My apartment was back to normal. The lights were on. The air was warm. But the figure was gone. And the letter, my letter, was nowhere to be found. I was alone again, but I knew I wouldn't be for long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back into my apartment. The stillness felt wrong, too quiet, like the calm before a storm. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling, but I forced myself to stand. I needed to get a grip. I had to understand what was happening, why I was being drawn into this nightmare. I reached for the phone again, desperate for some semblance of normality. I needed to talk to someone. Anyone. But once again, the calls went unanswered. My friends were unreachable, lost in a sea of unanswered messages and disconnected lines. The same sense of isolation I had felt at the house crept up on me again. The silence felt suffocating, and the shadows in my apartment began to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive, waiting. I tried to focus on something, anything, to keep my mind occupied. But it was futile. Every thought brought me back to that house, to that impossible invitation. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, trying to ground myself in the reality I had known before. The city, bustling and alive, seemed distant, unreachable. The dark shape of the building across the street caught my eye. It was the old warehouse, the one that had stood abandoned for years. I had always wondered what it had once been, but now it seemed almost like a beacon in the night, an invitation, a signal. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. The air in my apartment thickened, and I felt a presence behind me, as though the walls themselves had come alive. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. The darkness in the corners seemed deeper now, suffocating. A strange noise came from the hallway, a faint, almost inaudible creak, like a footstep. I stumbled back, panic flooding my chest. The voice from earlier echoed in my mind, "You should not have come." The words were like a warning, and I knew, deep down, that I had made a terrible mistake. But I didn't know how to undo it. I had broken some unseen rule, and now I was paying the price. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the empty doorway. It was then that I noticed it, the letter. The one that had disappeared. It was on the table in front of me, placed there as though it had never left. The paper was cold to the touch, the edges worn and brittle, like it had been through too much. I opened it slowly, my hand shaking, my mind clouded with dread. The message inside was the same, but now the words seemed darker, more insistent. "Come back. The night is waiting." I dropped the letter, my mind racing. What did it mean? What was waiting for me? And why did it feel like I had no choice but to follow it? Suddenly, the lights flickered. The room darkened, and the air grew impossibly cold. A low hum filled the silence, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. It was as though the apartment itself was alive, reacting to the invitation. And then, I heard it, a whisper, so faint, so close, I could almost feel it against my skin. "Come back." The voice was unmistakable. The same hollow, distorted voice that had spoken to me before. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing. No figure. No shadow. Just the silence. But the invitation was still there, lingering in the air, thick with the promise of something I couldn't yet understand. I knew I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. I grabbed my coat and keys, my hands numb as I moved to the door. My mind screamed for me to stay, to call someone, to run far away. But I couldn't. Something in me, something I couldn't explain, urged me forward, deeper into the unknown. It wasn't just curiosity, it was like a pull, a force greater than me. I stepped into the hallway, the door shutting behind me with a heavy thud. The building was eerily silent, the only sound my own footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. And then, just as I reached the staircase, I saw it. The figure. Standing at the end of the hall, waiting. It was the same one, but now I could see it clearly, its features sharp and distinct. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its eyes gleamed in a dim light, black pits that seemed to swallow the world around them. Its shape flickered like a shadow, but there was no mistaking its presence. It raised one hand, slowly, as though inviting me forward. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this was no ordinary figure. This was not a hallucination. It was real. And it was waiting for me. I took a step forward, my feet moving against my will. The figure did not move, but I could feel its gaze on me, drawing me in, pulling me closer to whatever it was that lay beyond the threshold. And then, as I crossed the threshold into the darkened stairwell, everything went black. Have you ever bought something that seemed like a simple purchase, but then everything started to change? That's how it all began for me. It wasn't much, just an antique mirror I found in a small shop down the street. I had always been drawn to old things, to the stories they carried, to the lives they had witnessed. When I saw the mirror, I couldn't resist. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with tired eyes, smiled as he handed it over. "It's a special one," he said. "You might want to be careful with it." I laughed it off, thinking it was just a quirky line, a sales tactic. But looking back now, I wish I had listened. I placed it in my hallway, right where I could see it every day. At first, it was like any other mirror. I would pass by, glance at myself, fix my hair, and go on with my day. But slowly, something changed. It wasn't immediate, no dramatic moment. Just small things at first, a slight shift in the reflection, something out of place. One evening, after a long day at work, I stood before the mirror, exhausted. I looked into it, and for the first time, I saw something behind me. Something dark. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, as it should have been. It happened again the next night. I had just gotten home, and as I walked past the mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself, not just as I was, but as something else. A shadow seemed to cling to my reflection, just out of sync. It was almost like there was another person standing beside me, a stranger in my own skin. I leaned in closer, staring at the reflection, but the moment I did, the figure disappeared. I laughed nervously to myself, brushing off the thought. Maybe it's just the lighting, I told myself. Just a trick of the eyes. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It felt like the mirror was showing me something else. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds, soft whispers, like the faintest hum, coming from the hallway. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I lay there, the louder it seemed. I finally got out of bed and crept into the hallway. The mirror stood there, waiting, as if it had been expecting me. I walked closer to it, drawn in by some unseen force. My reflection stared back at me, but now it seemed different. The figure in the mirror didn't move the way I did. It lingered a fraction of a second too long, its gaze following me even when I moved. I reached out a hand to touch the glass, half expecting the surface to be cold or to distort in some way, but it felt perfectly normal, smooth, warm, almost inviting. But then, something shifted. I could see it clearer now. My reflection wasn't just mirroring me anymore. It was starting to do things I wasn't. Small movements. My reflection tilted its head at an angle I didn't. A chill ran down my spine. I pulled my hand back quickly and turned away, my breath quickening. But before I could even reach the door, the reflection in the mirror changed. Slowly, it smiled at me. Not the smile I knew. This smile was not mine. My own reflection didn't just smile, it grinned, a wide, unnerving expression, one that twisted its features in a way I couldn't comprehend. I stepped back, my legs shaking. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood frozen. What was this? What was happening? Suddenly, my reflection's eyes locked with mine, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something or someone else entirely in its gaze. A dark figure. A shadow standing behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but the hallway was empty, just as it should have been. I was breathing heavily now, feeling a deep sense of unease crawling through my veins. My reflection stared at me, motionless, its grin never fading. I stepped forward, my mind racing with questions. What was it? Why was it doing this? Was it trying to tell me something? But the more I thought about it, the more the room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt smaller, the air thicker. I turned away from the mirror and fled to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. But no matter how hard I tried to sleep, the image of that grin stayed with me. It haunted my thoughts, whispered at the edges of my mind. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else, something that wanted to be me. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized one chilling truth. I had bought more than just a mirror. I had bought a doorway. And now, something on the other side wanted to come through. And worse yet, it seemed like it was willing to do anything to get out. The days that followed were strange. The mirror sat in the hallway, unchanged, yet somehow it felt different, like it had taken on a life of its own. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, the grin, the reflection that wasn't mine. Every time I walked past it, I felt a pull, an urge to look again, to see if it would happen again. But each time, it was just a reflection. Just me. But I knew, deep down, something was off. I told myself to stay calm, to stop letting my imagination run wild. I mean, it was just a mirror, right? Mirrors weren't supposed to do anything unusual. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the glass had some sort of weird distortion or reflection trick. Maybe the house was settling, and it caused shadows to appear strangely. But nothing explained that smile. That grin. I had to know more. I couldn't let it go. The next evening, I found myself standing before the mirror again. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stared at my reflection, feeling the familiar weight of my gaze on the glass. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror was still, my face staring back at me like it always had. But then, I noticed something. The space behind me, just beyond the reflection, looked different. It was as if the hallway behind me wasn't quite the same. The walls seemed a shade darker. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, almost unnaturally so. I blinked, stepping closer to the glass. My reflection, though it mirrored me perfectly, didn't look the same. The figure behind me wasn't my hallway anymore. It was another place. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was as it should have been, the familiar white walls, the dim light from the single bulb hanging overhead. But the reflection, the reflection was changing. It wasn't my hallway anymore. There was a room, large, dim, and unfamiliar. Old furniture stood in the corners, covered with dusty sheets. It looked abandoned. And, most chilling of all, there was a door at the far end of the room. The door was open, but there was nothing behind it. Just darkness. I couldn't pull my eyes away. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be seeing it. Like it was something I shouldn't have found. But as I stared at the reflection, the door creaked just a little. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection mimicked me, of course, stepping back as I did. But I knew it wasn't just me in the reflection anymore. There was something else. It was as if the mirror was opening up, pulling me in. I glanced around the hallway, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. The door in the reflection was no longer empty. Now, a figure stood in the doorway. I couldn't make out its features, but I could see its outline, tall, thin, with long, unnaturally long arms. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. I stepped forward, barely able to breathe. The air was thick, heavy with an almost palpable tension. The figure in the reflection still didn't move, but I felt it watching me. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe it was curiosity, or fear, or something else that urged me forward. My fingers touched the surface of the mirror, and for a second, I felt nothing. It was just glass. But then, a chill shot through my hand, and the reflection shuddered. The figure in the doorway blinked, or at least, it seemed to. It was like it was alive now, reacting to me. And then, the grin. That same grin from before, stretching impossibly wide across the figure's face, though it wasn't me in the reflection anymore. It was someone else. It was her. I pulled my hand back in horror, stumbling away from the mirror. The figure in the reflection stepped forward. The doorway was no longer empty, no longer distant. It was right there, close enough that I could almost hear its breathing, feel the weight of its stare. The figure moved, taking a slow step out of the reflection. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was coming out. And that grin, it was all I could see. All I could focus on. I turned and ran. I couldn't stop myself. I bolted down the hallway, straight to the front door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The door, my escape, was locked. I turned around, panic flooding through me. The hallway was empty, quiet. But behind me, in the reflection, the figure had crossed the threshold of the doorway. It was standing in the mirror now, inches from the glass. And that smile, it was no longer just a grin. It was a full-on laugh, twisted and distorted, like something not quite human. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure's eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just a reflection. It was her. She wanted to take my place. And she was getting closer. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the mirror, frozen in terror. Every inch of my being screamed to look away, to run, to do something, anything. But I couldn't move. The figure, she, was still there, grinning at me. Her smile grew wider, more distorted, as if she was enjoying my fear. It was almost as if she were beckoning me, urging me to come closer. I felt the strange pull again, like I was being drawn to the glass. My mind screamed at me to stay away, but my feet, they moved of their own accord. Slowly, almost against my will, I stepped forward. The air grew colder with each step, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a chill running down my spine. My reflection was no longer me. It was her. She was standing where I should have been, wearing my face, but twisted. Her expression was unnatural, almost too perfect, like a mask that had been forced onto her. The smile, God, that smile, had turned into something more sinister, a stretched, grotesque grin that seemed to devour the space around her. I backed away, shaking, but as I did, my reflection, her reflection, didn't move with me. It stayed in place, eyes locked onto mine, its smile growing larger. I had to get away from the mirror. I had to leave. Turning on my heel, I ran through the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath was quick and shallow as I reached the door, only to find it locked, the cold metal handle unyielding beneath my fingers. Panic gripped me. I tried again, pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't open. The room around me seemed to be closing in. The silence was deafening. The only sound was my racing pulse and the frantic thudding of my heart. I spun back toward the mirror. I had to see it again. I had to understand what was happening. My reflection was still there, her reflection, grinning, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly hunger. She wasn't just a copy of me anymore, she had become something more. The longer I looked, the more I realized I wasn't just seeing a reflection. I was seeing a window into her world, into her reality. And she wasn't just watching me, she was waiting for me. Her hand, no, my hand, slowly lifted in the reflection. It was as if I were watching myself, but I knew I wasn't. I couldn't stop staring as my reflection, her reflection, mimicked every movement I made. Every tremor in my hand, every step backward, every breath. But then, she moved differently. She tilted her head, in the same way I had done only moments ago. But her eyes didn't just follow me. They locked on, calculating, studying, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The reflection's grin grew wider, as if she had figured something out. That's when I realized she was the one in control. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. The mirror was no longer just a mirror. It was a doorway, a way for her to cross into my world. I turned again, but this time my hand didn't find the door handle. Instead, I felt a strange tug in my chest, like I was being pulled toward the mirror. My legs moved of their own accord, as if some invisible force had taken hold of me. No! I screamed, my voice shaking. But the words felt hollow, as if they weren't even my own. I was helpless, a spectator in my own body. My reflection, the reflection that wasn't mine, smiled wider. And then, she stepped through. I don't know how it happened. One moment, she was just a figure in the glass, and the next, I felt a coldness at my side. A cold that was not of this world. The air around me grew thick and heavy, like I was suffocating, and I turned to face her. She was standing right next to me. My heart stopped. Her eyes locked with mine, the same eyes that had once been my own. But now, they were empty, hollow. There was nothing behind them. Just darkness. And that smile, it wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. Her voice was soft, but it sent chills down my spine. Now it's my turn, she whispered, as her hand reached out toward me. My legs trembled beneath me. I was paralyzed, unable to move. All I could do was watch as she took a step closer, her hand now hovering inches from my face. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against me, as if the room itself was closing in. I knew what she wanted. She wanted to take me, take my place. With a burst of adrenaline, I shoved myself backward, finally breaking free from the strange force that had been pulling me toward her. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving with panic. I couldn't let her win. But she was still there, smiling, watching me. I could feel the mirror behind me, its surface cold against my back. My heart was pounding in my chest, my head spinning with fear and confusion. And then, I heard it. A faint tapping, like a soft knock on glass. It was coming from the mirror. I turned to look, my breath catching in my throat. In the reflection, she was still standing there, my reflection, fingers tapping on the glass. But there was something else. Something more. Behind her, there was movement. Shadows. Figures. Others. Hundreds of them, pressing against the glass, reaching out toward me. I didn't know how much time I had left. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figures pressing against the glass were not just shadows, they were people, or at least what used to be people. Their faces were pale, distorted by the glass as though they were trapped in some kind of purgatory, their hands stretched toward me. And then, she, the version of me who had crossed through, spoke. "You can't escape now." Her voice was soft, too soft, like it didn't belong to her. It wasn't human. It wasn't mine. It came from somewhere deep, a place where even the shadows were afraid to go. Her hands slowly lowered, her fingers still twitching with that unnatural rhythm. The tapping had stopped. I felt the room closing in, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Every breath I took felt like a gasp for air I couldn't reach. "You can never go back," she repeated, stepping forward. I stumbled away from the mirror, my body shaking violently. My legs were weak beneath me, and every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I knew I couldn't run from what was happening. I couldn't escape it. The space around me was warping, the walls twisting as if they were stretching and bending at her will. I was trapped, I realized. There was nowhere left to go. I glanced at the mirror again, and the reflection was shifting. The world I knew, the one behind the glass, was blurring, morphing into something else. It was no longer just a reflection. It was a place that had become all too real. I couldn't breathe. I turned back to face the thing that had taken my place. The woman, my reflection, was watching me with a calm that made my blood run cold. "I'm taking what's mine," she said, her smile still stretched too wide. Her voice now sounded like 1,000 voices whispering, all layered on top of one another. "You've lived my life for too long, but I will take back everything." I reached out to touch the mirror, hoping for some kind of escape, but my fingers passed right through it. There was no glass. There was only the void. Her face, my face, appeared in front of me, but now it wasn't just a reflection. It was a reality. The room behind me, the one I had known just moments before, was now filled with shadows, and I realized she had come into my world. Her hand, so close now, reached for my throat. I tried to scream, to fight, but it was as if I had lost control of my body. My skin felt tight, like something was crawling beneath it, tearing at the very fibers of my existence. "Please," I whispered, but even the please sounded foreign, disconnected from my own voice. Her fingers closed around my neck with a grip that was cold, too cold. But then the world around me seemed to warp again. The shadows behind her grew stronger. The mirror was now fully transparent, a doorway into her world. I could see them all, the other figures, the ones that had been pressing against the glass earlier. They were all there, crowded behind her, their faces gaunt and empty. I felt them watching me, waiting for the moment when they could take their turn. Suddenly, I understood. The mirror wasn't just a portal, it was a prison. A prison for all of them. And now, she was free. But the others? They were still trapped, waiting. The realization hit me like a wave. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to have crossed over. But I had. I had crossed the line. And now, there would be no going back. Her smile twisted again, dark and evil. "It's too late," she whispered. I managed to summon every ounce of strength I had left, shoving her away from me. She staggered back, her eyes wide with fury, but the force of her own shadow seemed to drag her toward the mirror. She fought to regain her balance, but it was too late. The door, the portal, was closing. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, I ran toward the door, the coldness of the air biting at my skin. I reached for the handle, and this time it opened. The door creaked as I stepped through, not looking back. I didn't want to know what was behind me anymore. The moment I stepped through, everything fell silent. The mirror, the room, the shadows, they all disappeared. I was back in my apartment. Everything seemed just the way it had been before. But I knew it wasn't the same. I was different. I could feel the change in my bones. Something inside me was broken, shattered, like the mirror that had tried to pull me into its twisted world. And then, as if it were the last cruel trick of the thing that had taken my place, I heard it. A faint tapping. It came from the mirror. The tapping was back. But now, it wasn't just a reflection. It was inside the room. I turned, my heart sinking. In the mirror, there was nothing but darkness. And then, I saw the eyes. Her eyes. Staring back at me. The tapping grew louder. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was everywhere. Every surface, every corner of the room seemed to reverberate with that chilling sound. I turned, desperate to find this source, but the apartment seemed impossibly still. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting, watching. I forced myself to look at the mirror once more. The darkness behind it had deepened. It was no longer simply a reflection, it was a void, a space that seemed to stretch out infinitely. My own face stared back at me, but it wasn't me anymore. The eyes that stared out from the glass weren't mine. They were hers. I took a step toward the mirror, my heart racing in my chest. Something was pulling me closer, as if the glass itself was alive, calling me in. I could hear her voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering from beyond. "You should never have come back." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't look away. My hand trembled as I reached out, drawn toward the cold surface. The moment my fingers brushed the glass, everything around me seemed to freeze. The sounds of the apartment, the faint hum of the city outside, all of it vanished. All I could hear was her voice, louder now, reverberating in my mind. "I've waited so long for this," she said. And then, something shifted. The mirror cracked. A small fracture appeared at the center, spider-webbing outward, spreading like a living thing. The edges of the mirror began to warp, distorting my reflection. The woman in the mirror was smiling now, an expression that was somehow both familiar and alien. Her eyes glinted with something dark, something that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow. The crack in the mirror expanded, and suddenly I saw not just her face, but everything. I saw the room behind her, the twisted, corrupted version of the place I had just left. The walls were covered in shadows, and the floor seemed to ripple like it was made of water. The space was alive, and it was calling me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No." But the mirror wasn't done. The crack widened even further, and through it, I could see the outline of a figure stepping forward. It wasn't her, no, it was something worse. A silhouette of a person who moved with a kind of purpose, a kind of intention. The figure's face was obscured, but I could feel it watching me. And then, without warning, the mirror shattered. The pieces fell to the ground in a cascade of jagged edges, but they didn't stop. They didn't fall to the floor. They hovered, suspended in the air, circling around me like a swarm of angry bees. Each shard reflected a different part of the room, a different reality. Some of them reflected the apartment I knew, while others reflected the twisted, dark version of the place that lay beyond. I screamed, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The pieces were closing in on me. And then I saw her, my reflection, emerging from the shards. She was stepping through the pieces of glass, each one like a portal opening. Her smile was wide and predatory, and her eyes burned with a madness I couldn't comprehend. "I've come for what's mine," she hissed. I tried to turn, to run, but the glass was everywhere. It was in the walls, the ceiling, the floor. There was no escape. I could feel her hand on my shoulder, cold and firm, like ice. It was too much. My body froze. I was trapped. There was no way out. "You should have never crossed over," she whispered in my ear. Her voice wasn't just in my head now, it was everywhere. Her presence was suffocating, overwhelming. My own reflection, my own face, twisted and contorted into something that no longer resembled me. And then I understood. The mirror was never just a reflection. It was a doorway into something far worse. And now I had let it in. With a final, desperate scream, I felt myself being pulled toward the shattered glass. My body was no longer mine. I was slipping away, pulled into the void, consumed by the reflection that was never meant to be. In the last moments of consciousness, I saw her face one final time. My face. But it was smiling. And then everything went dark. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.